Hello and welcome to the Week in 60 Minutes, brought to you by SpectatorTV and broadcast on Thursday, the 7th of April. I'm Kate Andrews, the Spectator's economics editor, and your host this week. On this week's show, Russia has withdrawn forces from the north of Ukraine to focus its offensive on the east of the country. We'll get the latest with the historian Antony Beevor and writer James Meek. It comes as pictures emerged of a mass grave in Bucha, 20 kilometers to the north of Kyiv. Fraser Nelson writes this week's cover piece on the politics of war crimes, and he'll join us on the show. After 15 years in power, what is the SNP's record in Scotland? James Heale and Michael Simmons write this week about the, quote, poor planning, willful waste, and absence of accountability, end quote, that have characterized their time in power. We'll speak to James as well as Jackie Baillie, deputy leader of Scottish Labour. Number 10 has gone through multiple rounds of staffing since Boris Johnson became Prime Minister. What is the current face of Number 10? Katy Balls writes the politics column in this week's magazine, and she'll join me on the show. And finally, Paul Wood writes in this week's magazine about the fate of Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko and how it depends on the war in Ukraine. He'll join me to explain. But before we get going, a reminder to subscribe to the Spectator magazine. You get 12 issues of the magazine for just £12 and a free £20 Amazon voucher too. Just go to spectator.co.uk/TV offer. And why not subscribe to our YouTube channel too? Just click the red subscribe button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon to make sure you never miss an episode. Russian forces have withdrawn from the north of Ukraine after suffering heavy defeats in the area around Kyiv. I'm joined now by Sir Antony Beevor, a military historian and the author of Stalingrad, and James Meek, a contributing editor at the London Review of Books, who has reported on conflicts in Eastern Europe and the Middle East. Antony, James, thanks for joining us. James, we've seen the collapse of the Russian invasion in the north of Ukraine. What's next?
Well, it's widely assumed that what's next is a renewed assault on Ukrainian positions in eastern Ukraine. When the invasion began, the strongest part of the Ukrainian army was based in the east, in that part of the eastern Donbass region, which Russia and its local proxy forces had not managed to conquer. And at the outset of the war, it was one of the stated war aims of Russia to conquer the whole of the Donbass, not simply those parts that they already had, but to take control of the entire region. So if Russia was able to sweep back those very, very heavily entrenched Ukrainian forces from the rest of the Donbass, they could have the beginnings of something that they could call a victory in time for Victory Day on May the 9th. But of course, there are many, many complications to that. One is now that the Russians have withdrawn from the north of Ukraine, the Ukrainians have forces free to shore up their positions in the Donbass. The other is that simply, can the Russians do it? Do they have the forces? Do they have the men? Do they have the equipment to break down this extremely stubborn Ukrainian resistance, given that it has been well over a month now that they have been trying to subjugate a single city, Mariupol, in the south of the Donbass, and they haven't yet managed to do that. There are a whole series of cities in the Donbass that the Ukrainians currently hold. They're well dug in, and it will not be easy and it will not be fast for the Russians to conquer them. The second massive issue is that in the course of their invasion, the Russians have conquered other large areas of southern Ukraine between Crimea and Donbass. That's partly the Donbass region, but also the south of Zaporozhye region, a very, very large civilian nuclear power plant in Zaporozhye, which is still under Russian control, and most complex of all, Kherson region, which is in the very west of this area that we're talking about. And I think if we're looking at some kind of future armistice, perhaps, along the Korean model, which clearly would be very unsatisfactory to the Ukrainians and in some ways to the Russians. But it's a possible way forward. I think it's that area of uncertainty as to what it is that Russia wants and what it is that Ukraine can regain in that area of the southwest, in the kind of the approaches to Odessa that causes a lot of problems. But briefly, and without going into all these details of strategy and tactics and geography, I think what we can look forward to in the next few weeks is much more blood and toil and slaughter and hideous and unnecessary waste of life and human capital.
I want to come on to the aspect of war crimes in a bit, but first, Antony, you've said that Putin is, quote, militarily locked in the past, end quote. Can you expand on this? And are you surprised at his army's collapse in the north?
I'm not entirely surprised. I think we tended to underestimate the degree of corruption within the Russian military. Putin's Russia is not the Soviet Union, and Putin's army is certainly not the Red Army. And what we saw was an extraordinary repetition of the mistakes which actually the Red Army had made itself in the Second World War. And a lot of this comes from Putin's distorted obsession with the Second World War. The way that they sent their tanks in a straight line without infantry support in those first few days, when it appeared, and I think it was sort of part of the original plan, was really to split Ukraine down the middle along the line of the Dnieper. And they were even, Russian tank troops were even adding bedsteads and other things to the top of their tanks, hoping that would provoke early explosions or premature explosions of anti-tank rockets. Well, this was exactly what they'd done in 1945, attacking into Berlin. He'd also prepared the troops with ideas that they would be greeted as liberators. Well, there we have 1968 and what happened in Prague when the Warsaw Pact forces arrived, and they found themselves being spat at and cursed by the Czechs. This obsession with the past certainly does seem to have affected their tactics. What they are also, I think, trying to do, adding on to what James has just been saying, I think the great hope was this attack down the centre, down the line of the Dnieper, was also going to lead to a massive envelopment of the Ukrainian forces in eastern Ukraine facing the Donbass. But I think that the collapse of that particular axis of advance has now gone far enough, and I think therefore the Russians' chances of really achieving the sort of decisive victory that they hoped for has rather disappeared. Much will, of course, depend on how morale holds up. I think there have been over-optimistic reports in the Western press that there is an imminent collapse of the whole of the Russian army. So far they haven't been bringing in blocking troops or blocking groups as they had, as Stalin did in 1942. But there is no doubt that they will be using much more severe sanctions against their own troops, with probably shooting deserters and so forth. What was becoming increasingly clear is that Putin is as pitiless towards his own people as he is towards the Ukrainians. As we saw with the preparations for dealing with bodies, the mobile crematorium brought in, and the whole question of the disposal of bodies of their own troops in Ukraine. And I think that is producing a great deal of anger within the army, but also spreading to the civilian population. But that does not mean that there will be a palace coup against Putin or anything like that. I think that's being far too optimistic, but I'm sure we'll be going on to that in a moment.
Antony, on that point, what is the current state of Ukraine's resistance right now, and how effective do you think it will be in countering a deployed Russia in the east?
I think the state of Ukrainian resistance has been most impressive. I think that they managed to get in some vital training just in time. I think that the British training teams out there did an incredible job with the NLAWs and all the rest of it. And there's no doubt about the state of morale. I think it's shaken the Russians. It's even perhaps shaken the Ukrainians themselves at how well they have performed. There have been some very clever tactics used, use of drones and other original areas. And this again is an example of how Putin has not learnt from, for example, the effect of tanks. There is Putin, as I say, obsessed with the Second World War, where the tank was a symbol of power and strength. Almost invincible, but we see the tanks being taken out again and again and in many long lines, and he did not learn the lessons either from Libya or Nagorno-Karabakh in the fighting between the Armenians and Azerbaijanis, and that actually war has changed. And also the Russian army has not learnt how to engage in urban warfare, and not as the way that the Allies did in Iraq, for example, with Raqqa and so forth, by cordoning off sectors of a city, surrounding it, cordoning off sectors and doing it in a progressive way. All they've done is they've tried to charge in. If that didn't work, and then they resorted to artillery, thermobaric weapons, and just general destruction. So there's very little, shall we say, modern thinking on urban warfare going on at the moment in the Russian army, and that is perhaps one of the reasons why they've lost so many senior officers.
James, last question to you. Obviously, what we're discovering in Ukraine, evidence of these war crimes makes it much harder to engage in peace negotiations. If a peace agreement were found between Russia and Ukraine, what's the likelihood that Putin would stick to it?
He has shown himself not to be a very trustworthy individual, I think the striking thing about these crimes that we are now seeing, I would argue that the entire war is a crime, and these horrific episodes of killing civilians and torturing civilians are only one part of the overall crime of the war. But how can we possibly be surprised at what this regime in Russia has done? Not just after what happened in Syria, but after what Putin did in Chechnya. It was such a clear forerunner of the attitude of the man, namely, here is Chechnya, an indivisible part of Russia, which must be Russian, and therefore it must be utterly and mercilessly razed to the ground in order that this place, which we love so much, should be returned to us. It's that mixture of a demand for essential blood relatives to be reunited with the murder of these blood relatives that we saw in 2000, and yet between then and now 22 years have passed, and there has been so much accommodation with this man from not just from the obvious suspects of Donald Trump and Nigel Farage and Alex Salmond, but from British Petroleum and Shell and all the vast cash handling enterprises of the City of London. So this is not a new situation. And as far as the peace talks are concerned, it is going to be a very bitter pill to swallow. This is a Slobodan Milosevic figure that we are negotiating with, and we cannot realistically expect that he is going to be in the dock at The Hague, because Russia is one of the biggest nuclear powers on the planet, and Putin is, unless somebody has some brilliant suggestion, or unless there is this extremely unlikely palace coup, he is virtually immune from that kind of reach. So some kind of deal is going to have to be made, and I think the least unpalatable version, and it is going to be unpalatable, whatever happens, is the maximum degree of Ukrainian military success, which will almost certainly not be the complete recapture of all lost Ukrainian territory from 2014. The maximum possible degree of Ukrainian military success, an armistice along Korean lines or a peace along Cyprus lines, where the war is not over, there is no peace treaty, but the fighting has stopped, and a clear line is drawn between the two sides. I think the absolutely crucial thing after a line is drawn, hopefully with as much of Ukraine intact as possible. After that line is drawn, what is the West going to do to protect that line? Because I do not feel that a simple piece of paper is enough. And I think that's where the trust in Putin becomes extremely problematic. There will need to be a peace deal. There will need to be negotiations with Putin. But if they are not backed up by something more than a piece of paper to stop the Russians when they have paused, had another think, built up their army again, from simply going back in for another go, I think we're going to need more than a treaty for that.
Antony and James, thanks for joining Spectator TV. So if Russia has committed war crimes in Ukraine, can Putin and his army be prosecuted for them? Can we really expect to see them in the docks? Fraser Nelson, the Spectator's editor, writes this week's cover story about the politics of war crimes, and he joins the show now. Fraser, thanks for joining me. You write in this week's cover piece that the mass grave in Bucha represented the kind of barbarism that Europe thought it had left behind in the last century. What was your reaction when you saw the atrocities coming out of Ukraine? And what's been the reaction of Western governments?
Well, these pictures of the dead bodies of children, of mutilated corpses of civilians, were as sickening as anything that I've seen in my lifetime, certainly in this continent. And it brought back to mind, actually, an old quote in Jon Barker about how we like to think that we're so civilized, but it's the divide between our civilized life and the reign of Saturn is very, very thin. It's a sheet of glass, a tap here, a tap there, and we descend into barbarism. Now, it's just amazing how quickly that happened in the First World War, the Second World War, and now we're seeing it happen again in front of our eyes. What is strange here is that we're now watching it in real time. We're watching it just a few hours flight here from London, and it is being documented by Western satellites. When the Russians tried to make out that these images were fake, we were able to say very quickly, no, they weren't, because here are the satellite images taken just a few days ago. And yet there's a strange feeling of impotence, because we all know that if we were to go and confront Russia directly, if we were to send in the British military or impose one of these no-fly zones, that would mean war with a nuclear power, a far wider conflagration, and potentially far more deaths. So there is a feeling of horror, of disbelief. I guess it challenges your notion of history and progress. I mean, it's funny to think that you would ever live to see these scenes again, but they're happening now, and they could get worse. I guess that gives the question for a lot of people, what, if anything, can be done?
President Biden has received some criticism for saying that Putin is a war criminal. Do you think that language is helpful?
No, it's not helpful for quite a big reason. To be accused of war crimes is quite important. If you're an accused war criminal, then you can never leave your country. You can be arrested anywhere where Interpol can put out a warrant. And there is a logic in warfare for allowing the bad guy a ticket out, a bridge where he can retreat over if he wants. So if you were to indict Putin for war crimes, you would basically be saying to him that there's no way out for him, not in his lifetime. The argument is that might encourage somebody like Putin to fight on to the last, rather than cut his losses and withdraw. That's why Boris Johnson, for example, has been saying to Russians in a video this week that your president has been accused of war crime. Boris is quite careful not to make that accusation himself, and even Biden's officials have said that he misspoke, that he is not personally accusing Putin of war crimes. He just thinks there should be a war crimes trial, which it certainly seems there will be.
So if we're not going to be sending boots to the ground of Ukraine, and we're not going to be calling Putin a war criminal, and we're going to be careful with our language, what realistically can Western governments do about any of this? More sanctions? I mean, they're coming, they're being implemented, but so far sanctions don't seem to have stopped Putin's atrocities, and it hasn't seemed to stop the Russian soldiers from increasing evidence now that they have been torturing, raping, and killing innocent civilians.
Well, there are things that we can do. We can increase the sanctions. Right now Europe is still buying about $500 million of oil a day from Russia. That could be cut down, although it would be painful. Britain and other countries can send a higher grade of weapons to the Ukrainians to help them not just defend their territory, but to take the fight to the Russians in the occupied parts of Ukraine and try and push them out. But I do think that the war crimes agenda can also help. If you document these things in real time, we're talking not just the videos like Zelensky showed to the United Nations, but forensic evidence. Then you can start to name the guilty Russians. The Ukrainians are a few weeks, perhaps months most, away from doing that, certainly issuing their own indictments for their own courts. Then you can send a message, certainly to people around Putin, that what he's doing here is an act of barbarism, and it is the kind of, it will go down not like Georgia, not Crimea. Those were relatively straightforward conflicts. This will go down in the annals of human barbarism. And those who were complicit, or those who could have stopped it and didn't, will have a case to answer themselves. So I do think that this helps focus a lot of people's minds on the sheer barbarism of what's going on right now. It's almost impossible to write this off as some kind of border dispute between two former parts of the Soviet Empire. We've seen China, we've seen India, South Africa try their best to be neutral. It gets pretty hard to be neutral when we're seeing scenes like those at Bucha.
I was fascinated to read in your piece how much the British Justice Department is doing to help document these war crimes. Can you talk us through it?
Yes, well, just as Britain was one of the first countries to send arms to Ukraine, we did that back in January, we've been one of the first countries to send legal help as well. So right at the start, we've said, look, if you want help documenting these war crimes, then we can do this. We've got experience of this. You need quite a high caliber of evidence to prosecute a war crime. I mean, back in Kosovo, for example, we'd had a few bits of VHS footage, not much. In Syria, the game had changed completely. Something like 3.5 million videos have been sent in as evidence of war crimes in the Syrian conflict. Of those, about 500,000, not much more, have actually been assessed. And of that 500,000, barely 8,000 have been accepted as admissible evidence. So the amount of validation you have to do, the amount of documentation you need to do is absolutely huge. We have offered British intelligence services whose communications intercepts helped call out Putin on this way before he actually invaded Ukraine. British and American intelligence were saying this is what he's going to do. And we knew that because we've got a pretty good line into what Russians are saying to each other. That can be used to help build the case for prosecution. There are other things Britain can do, like legal clerks. We're offering to send lawyers over to conduct interviews to make sure the statements are conducted in a way that would stand muster in an international court. Even SO15, the unit of the Metropolitan Police, is being used to build evidence. They're right now doing it with Rwandan war crimes. And we are putting that clerical skill, which we built over the years, to bear. So right now there's two parallel investigations. There's the International Criminal Court in The Hague, but Ukraine is making its own domestic case. Now their chances of getting defendants are pretty slim, but what they hope to do is to let every Russian know that this in 2022, if you invade a country, what you do can be intercepted, the cameras can come after you, the satellites can come after you, your communications can be on the record, and you can be indicted. And that indictment can go on the record. You can be named and shamed. So there is no cloak of invisibility that covers you in war. Not anymore, not in this digital age. Now this might, at a push, give Putin's generals, even some of the soldiers, pause before they conduct the atrocities like we saw in Bucha. I think the message is going out now, but there are eyes on you, there are ears on you, and even if you're covered by your country, you can be named and exposed by digital means.
And yet your sources in the piece are still telling you that there's a slim to nothing chance that prosecutions will happen. Are we in danger of fooling ourselves into thinking that this is going to be successful?
After Srebrenica, we didn't really think that Radan Karadzic would be apprehended, but he was. He was arrested in 2008, and right now he's in jail in the Isle of Wight. People didn't really think that Charles Taylor, the former president of Liberia, would ever be arrested for what he did in Sierra Leone, but he was, and right now he's in jail in Durham. So the impossible can sometimes happen. Although when you're looking at collapsing states, there's a way higher chance that you would get to the perpetrators there. But in a place like Russia, even if Putin falls, he might be replaced by somebody worse. It's hard to see Russia ever surrender its generals or its former presidents to an international criminal court whose authority is not recognised by the United States, let alone Russia itself. So that actually seeing Russians in the dock is unlikely. But then again, as the saying goes, the process can be the punishment. If you do see war crime dossiers being collated online, if every single movement is done, if the forensic evidence is uploaded, then you can show the court of public opinion the evidence for the prosecution, and you can let all the invading forces know that the eyes of the world are on them. I do think that serves a purpose. During the course of researching this piece, I've become a lot more persuaded about just how worthwhile this is. I mean, yes, it's a very expensive process, but war is a very expensive process. I think shining a light on war crimes that would otherwise go undetected and certainly unexplored, there's a huge value to that, even if there's a scant chance that you will end up with a prosecution and a conviction at the end of it.
Fraser, thanks for joining me. The SNP has been in power in Holyrood for 15 years now. In this week's magazine, James Heale, the Spectator's diary editor, and Michael Simmons, our data journalist, write that Nicola Sturgeon has created one of the most opaque and centralized governments in Europe. To discuss, James joins me now alongside Jackie Baillie, Deputy Leader of Scottish Labour. James and Jackie, thanks for joining me on Spectator TV. James, you along with our colleague Michael Simmons write this week about the, quote, poor planning, willful waste, and absence of accountability, end quote, of the Scottish National Party over the past 15 years in power. What, in your view, has gone so badly wrong?
Well, Kate, I think a number of things have gone wrong up in Scotland. I think the danger is that secret government tends to lead to bad government with a lack of transparency or any accountability mechanisms for some of the failures. So those failures are repeated and exacerbated. And the focal point for this story was looking at the Ferguson shipyard and what's gone wrong there. And now this is sort of 8 years of delay, misspending, and the original budget for these two original vessels has gone from 97 million to 240 million. And so the real issue is that not things that have gone wrong, but that these failures have been exacerbated by a failure to learn from mistakes. And the danger you have with the SNP, I think, is a party that's been in power 15 years now, and a tendency to think of itself as the state. And the danger is that any criticism is seen as somehow treason, and therefore you do not learn from what's gone wrong previously. And it just means a failure to learn, and that's why Scotland, I think, is suffering in its public sector outcomes.
Jackie, is James being unfair? I mean, things go wrong all the time in the public sector. It doesn't necessarily mean that something particularly sinister is going on.
No, I think he's perhaps being overly generous, if I could put it that way. You know, I've been in the Scottish Parliament since 1999, the very beginning, and I have never seen a more centralising, more secretive government than the one that's currently in power. And James is right. They simply do not accept they make mistakes or indeed learn from them. And what we're witnessing now is very much a centralising command and control structure that's controlled by Nicola Sturgeon at the very top. Dissent is just not allowed. Debate is stifled. And the committees of the Parliament do not have teeth. They don't seem to be able to challenge the First Minister because, of course, the SNP majority votes as one. You know, we don't have independent members on committees. They are very much creatures of their own party. If you take the Ferguson shipyard contract as an example, but it is excessively over budget, documents are missing that would tell us what actually happened. And it seems to be that key points in the contract were based on SNP conference or the referendum. And if you look at the timeline, there's certainly, in my view, not just serial incompetence, which is what I used to think it was, but actually an abuse of power. It is a disgraceful scandal and nobody is shedding light on it, and we need to understand the truth of what went on.
James, can you talk a bit about Nicola Sturgeon's office, which you and Michael mentioned in the piece, how it works, and why you think it differs from number 10? I mean, is it really any more secretive than what's happening in Whitehall?
Well, I think in Whitehall you certainly have a degree to which it's based on a balance of power. You know, you have the Treasury, you have the Foreign Office, you have a number of different Whitehall departments competing. And some might say that kind of competition does produce at least a degree of accountability, whereby, you know, you have a number of different ministers who can hold that Prime Minister to account. You know, the Prime Minister here, for instance, in London doesn't even have a department of his own. Whereas in Scotland, if you talk to civil servants, people involved in the government there, I mean, Nicola Sturgeon sort of looms like a zeppelin over the whole thing. Even sort of minor decisions get signed off by the First Minister, which is why some people find it hard to believe that in the Ferguson shipyard, she wasn't involved in signing off any of it. And that's why we've seen a lot of the briefings going on and a lot of the kind of spin that's happened because of what's happened. And what I think is the most important, Kate, is that the Scottish Government was set up and the Scottish Parliament was set up in 1999, and there was a real hope and expectation about it. Here was a chance for Scotland and Holyrood to do much better than Westminster. And the sad thing is that Nicola Sturgeon, a woman who was elected in 2014 as First Minister to be the most, quote, accessible First Minister ever, hasn't lived up to that expectation and promise, and that kind of self-renewal that was hoped for with the SNP when she was named First Minister after Alex Salmond left hasn't really taken place. And so I think the difference between the aspiration and reality, or the rhetoric and reality, is what is most damning about what's gone on in Scotland.
Jackie, James writes about Sturgeon's latest idea. As part of a pandemic law, the Scottish Government would be able to modify or amend any Act of Parliament without a vote. What do you make of those plans? Are they a non-starter in Holyrood?
I mean, frankly, I find them quite extraordinary. It is astonishing what's being described as sweeping Henry VIII powers that the Scottish Government is seeking will enable them, without scrutiny, without approval of the Scottish Parliament, to simply change existing primary legislation in whatever way they wish. Now, I think that, frankly, is just a power grab too far. If you look at the consultation, Civic Scotland is opposed to this. In fact, I think 80, if not 90% of the respondents said that this just went too far and was not appropriate. Unfortunately, the SNP now have a majority in the Parliament alongside their partners, the Greens, and so this will go through unless we can make sufficient noise to stop it from happening. But it is quite extraordinary that they now disregard the Parliament completely. Even during the pandemic, whilst it is appropriate to give people emergency powers, and the Parliament was able to do that quite quickly, the reality is when it comes to laying regulations, they lay them and only seek parliamentary approval after the event. That's not a smart way of doing it if you want to take everybody with you.
But as you say, Jackie, the SNP has their majority. You can make a lot of noise, but realistically, is there much more that you could do to stop them?
Well, I think, and what we've sought to do is when you find that the government isn't listening, then actually making common cause with Civic Scotland, with the experts and the professionals, whether it's in academia or in business, actually bears fruit. Because if the entire country is saying this is not the way to do things, then I do think any government, including Nicola Sturgeon's government, really need to sit up and listen. But I live in hope that might happen. But at the moment, what we're seeing is spin and assertion over evidence and scrutiny. And it's really depressing because devolution could be so much better than this.
James, you and Michael write that there are structural problems in the Scottish Parliament too. You write about the warnings that SNPs were given during the Alex Salmond trial, for example.
Yes, I mean, I think that Jackie touched on an important point, which is that, as long as you can, the one big thing with the Scottish electoral system was that people thought that no one would ever get a majority. But once you've got that, effectively there aren't many checks or balances. Compare it to Westminster, where you've got, for instance, the House of Lords, where you've got a much more dynamic political culture in terms of, backbenchers, Conservative MPs holding a Conservative government to account, or the same with Labour. The danger is you don't have those kind of things with the SNP up in Scotland. And I think that the danger is that with some of the Alex Salmond stuff, what went on was, frankly, a very dangerous mix of separation of powers being blurred. And frankly, the mechanism in Scotland was shown to be lacking. And the question is that now we have, as Jackie says, an SNP Green pro-independence government sort of just about propped up. Will we see any of those failures being addressed? And typically what's happened in Scotland over the last 15 years is that failures or institutions which are shown to be wanting have not been rectified, have not had any kind of sort of minor political or constitutional reform. And so it's the institutions that have been found wanting. And the danger is that there seems to be no impetus from the governing parties to rectify that anytime soon.
James, you say in your piece that the boundaries between the party and the state up in Scotland have in some cases become indistinguishable. You mentioned the shipyard. Are there other cases?
Yes, certainly is. And I think that a number of the civil servants up in Scotland, most recently Leslie Evans, who was the permanent secretary of the Scottish Government until she recently left earlier this year, have close connections to the party. And the danger is, of course, is that if you have a nationalist party in government, the tendency is to see that party as the party of government and the only legitimate voice in Scotland. And I think that Jackie and a number of other sort of politicians take a different view on that, have had those voices attempted to be shut down. And I don't think that's particularly healthy or productive for Scots, who at the end of the day have to live with the result of policies that politicians put through.
Jackie, last question to you. You said in February last year, during the fallout between Nicola Sturgeon and Alex Salmond, that, quote, there's something rotten at the core of the SNP, and it is poisoning our democratic institutions, end quote. Now, as somebody who works inside Scotland's political system every day, have you noticed any changes? Have things become better since last February?
No, in fact, they've become worse. I think the Scottish Government is less accountable, more centralising, much more secretive. I lived through the Salmond inquiry, and I have to say the level of obstruction from the Scottish Government was absolutely legendary. We were given papers only after we sought them doggedly for months and months. What we were given was by and large redacted. I mean, I recall a document of 22 pages where 20 pages were actually snow white because everything had been redacted. And they just simply refused to hand over information. I mean, they didn't just do it to a parliamentary committee. They did it in the courts as well, and judges had to order the government to hand over information. But, one example I would give you just recently is where the permanent secretary, who is retiring, was asked to appear before the Finance and Public Administration Committee of the Parliament. You would think it was an opportunity for her to talk about her achievements. She refused to attend. A serving senior civil servant simply refused to attend the committee, and she wasn't held to account by the Scottish Government, and therefore she was clearly too busy just preparing for her retirement. I find that scandalous, that the highest civil servant in Scotland is not instructed by ministers to attend a parliamentary committee.
Jackie and James, thanks for joining me. A recent poll from Conservative Home saw Boris Johnson's ratings increase by 15 points. Katy Balls writes in this week's magazine about the new team that has taken charge in number 10, putting Tory MPs at the centre of the operation. Are they behind Johnson's rise in popularity? Katy joins me now. Katy, thanks for joining Spectator TV. In your column for the magazine this week, you talk about the new face of number 10. Who are the players?
Well, I think the biggest group of players is actually just the parliamentary party. There's very much a sense of MPs taking back control. And we've had several incarnations of Downing Street under Boris Johnson. The first was Dominic Cummings and the Vote Leave group. And that was very much taking back control, centralising power and having little, regard for MPs. I think they're often viewed as a nuisance, partly because I think if you thought back to the EU referendum campaign, the Vote Leave team really felt as though part of the way that they won that referendum was not listening to the advice of some Tory grandees and actually charting a new course. And that carried through to Downing Street and created issues. Then you had Dan Rosenfield. He was the latest chief of staff. And Dan Rosenfield was a former Treasury civil servant. And while I think had a much more conciliatory tone of MPs, ultimately suffered the same issue as Dominic Cummings in the sense that Tory MPs did not really believe he was a party member or a party person, and also lacked, in the case of Dan Rosenfield, some political nous. We now have a situation where the new Chief of Staff in the wake of Partygate is Steve Barclay. He is a Tory MP. And this is a theme. You also have the head of policy, Andrew Griffith, is a Tory MP. And more generally, we're seeing this new team, which includes David Canzini, a former Tory party figure in terms of strategy coming in, and Guto Harry from Boris Johnson City Hall's days, and there is a big effort underway to rebuild ties with the parliamentary party and also the Tory grassroots, and we're seeing that in various ways.
And Katy, in your piece you explained that there's some benefits to bringing the MPs back into the fold, but we're also starting to see the different factions turn on each other as they feel like they might have a bit more power.
Yes, and I think what we're seeing is ultimately there's a big effort to listen more to MPs. So, for example, there are 2 meetings a week with Tory MPs just on policy with the various constituencies, trying to find out what they want, but also obviously hearing what Number 10 plans to do. There's also a political meeting every week, which is trying to avoid some of those self-forced errors, such as the Owen Paterson debacle, where the chief whip will be there along with the party chairman, and they'll meet with Number 10, which again gives you the mood of the parliamentary party. And special advisors were also told at a recent meeting by David Canzini, an ally of Linton Crosby, that they all needed to join the Tory party. Well, raise your hand if you are a member, and those who didn't raise their hand were instructed that what they need to do is fill in forms and remedy that. But I think there is obviously an issue in the sense the Tory party is so large now. If you look at the success of the 2019 election victory, the majority of 80, yes, should mean on paper they can do a lot of things, but also means you have a lot of different views, and on any single issue not everyone agrees. I think the general direction of this new team, part through necessity, but also in terms of what will please the highest number of Tory MPs and the base, is to have more conservative principles. That's what the new policy chief has told MPs. And there's been, I think, a move to the right. If you look at various decisions recently, such as the announcement they plan to privatise Channel 4, you can look at some of the rhetoric on trans issues, but for every single one of those issues, you are going to see a backlash on the left of the party, particularly the One Nation group. I think the question is, when you are seeing these potential rebellions coming up, is that something that will still allow Boris Johnson to get his way and push through his agenda, or could they miscalculate and actually the rebellion become so big that their plans are actually stopped in their tracks?
Katy, you just mentioned there the selling off of Channel 4, which has been in the news this week. It seems like a return to Operation Red Meat, which we were talking about a few months ago, an effort to appeal to the base, to the grassroots of the Tory party, and it wasn't said explicitly, but frankly to save the Prime Minister, who was going through some tough times with Partygate. Are these just recycled ideas we're seeing from the new players in Number 10, or is there something new afoot?
So I think what's interesting on Operation Red Meat was the effort immediately after Boris Johnson, I think, was in the most trouble on Partygate, when actually some of his old team who've now left, such as Dan Rosenfield, the then Director of Communications, Jack Doyle, have now left. But there was an effort there when it was talk of freezing the BBC licence fee, and ending COVID restrictions. I think the new team are not using the phrase Operation Red Meat. I think it suggests too limited policies, not policies for everyone. But it is in that same direction of trying to move to the right. But I think when you're looking at who they think they can win by doing this, there is more in the sense that, for example, we're expecting planning reforms to be ditched or heavily diluted in the Queen's speech next month. There was plans for a radical planning bill, and that is going to please MPs in the South rather than just Red Wall MPs. So I think it's a bit more wide-ranging than some of the initial things, which I think were viewed as almost, greatest hits for immediate effect.
Lastly, Katy, it's been a tough week for Chancellor Rishi Sunak. He has been falling in several polls, and there's news today about his wife's tax status. Tell us what's been happening and what it means for the Chancellor.
So I think we've seen Rishi Sunak's personal approving ratings slowly dropping, in recent months, and in a way that was inevitable. He ended last year as the most popular politician in the country, who was spending a lot of money for the first, tenure of his time as Chancellor. And as time goes on, I think it was always the case that it was going to dip. With the spring statement, that's been very sudden. You have a YouGov poll this week, which suggests that he is now behind Keir Starmer. Keir Starmer is also in the negative, so now all politicians, in terms of the main ones, are in the negative. So it's not quite something, I think, to write home about for the Labour leader. And there's also a Connor Home Cabinet League table, which is by Tory members, and Rishi Sunak has dropped to the bottom three. Boris Johnson has moved up. So clearly the tide is turning to a degree. What is interesting is as the mood music around Rishi Sunak changes and people are finding more issues with him, I think things that in the past haven't become live political issues, despite Labour trying, such as Rishi Sunak's wealth, are now being weaponised once again. So we saw a story this week about Rishi Sunak donating over £100,000, we think over several years, we don't know the details, to the private school he attended. And that was taken by Labour to say, well, he couldn't find money for the catch-up fund, but he could find money for this. Now, this is his own private money. The Labour attack line was almost suggesting he should privately pay for the, Kevin Collins at the time in his multi-billion-pound deal. So I think that had limited success, but you can see the narrative. I think the issue right now with the story over Rishi Sunak's wife and the non-dom status is we're still trying to find out the specific details of this, but as it has been reported, because Rishi Sunak's wife is Indian, she does not have dual citizenship, and it means that she has been paying on her foreign earnings from the family company that she owns a very small share in, but it's still a high worth share. You look at the how much that company is worth. She is paying a tax in India on that, and I think that clearly, I think just having the word non-dom, if you look at how, if you think back to the Lord Ashcroft peer row back in the day, is problematic for a chancellor at the time when they're raising taxes. But I think with this one, we're just going to have to see what more comes out and how that explanation, pans and stacks up.
I think it was always acknowledged that Rishi Sunak was going to hit a tough patch. It was understood that handing out billions upon billions of pounds, hundreds of billions of pounds, to people at home to pay their wages, to businesses, to give them loans to get through the pandemic was going to be quite good time for the Chancellor personally, and his popularity ratings. And then having to tighten that, having to have the honest conversation with the public about what that all really cost was going to be a more difficult time. And yet there still seems to be some element of surprise every time that Sunak falls in the polls. Do you think that this was always inevitable and there's an understanding that it was, or are things going especially bad at the moment?
I think he was always going to become more unpopular over time, particularly because of, as you say, the trajectory of spending lots of money and paying people's salaries, to suddenly saying we're raising taxes and it's going to be tough cost of living and we can't do everything to help you. That is tricky. I think what is making it a bit worse right now, though, is obviously, I think, just personal disclosures, stories about his wife's potential tax affairs. I think that's clearly a subject that makes Rishi Sunak very uncomfortable. He gave an interview in recent weeks saying, it's not fair game to come after my wife. And I think what we're seeing now is, how does he handle this level of scrutiny and pressure? I think that in some interviews he has seemed quite irritated by it. And therefore, I think what will help Rishi Sunak is full transparency and a calm approach, and what will make it worse is if it starts to look bad-tempered. And I think when it comes to tax affairs, you can obviously say your wife's a private individual. That's what we hear from the Treasury, so she should not be held to the same standards as a politician. I think most people would accept that, but I think there's still some legitimate questions that should be answered.
Katy, thanks for joining me. And finally, Paul Wood writes in this week's magazine about the Kaliningrad Battalion, a small group of volunteers from Belarus who are fighting for Ukraine against Russia. What does this say about the position of Belarusian dictator Alexander Lukashenko? Could a larger resistance from inside the country threaten his regime? Paul joins me now. Paul, thanks for joining Spectator TV. In your piece for the magazine this week, you talk about the small group of Belarusian volunteer soldiers who are on the front line of what's happening in Ukraine. Tell us about them.
Well, it is a small number, but I think symbolically important. Belarusian volunteers have been fighting in Ukraine since 2014. They were part of the Azov battalion, which has attracted its own controversies, allegedly for some of the neo-fascist leaning of some of its members. But these Belarusian volunteers have been there since 2014. And then they were formally incorporated into the Ukrainian armed forces 2 weeks ago. This is something the Ukrainians have been doing in order to give all the foreign volunteers fighting for them the protection of the Geneva Conventions. There are thousands of foreigners arriving in Ukraine, people from Europe, Britons, Americans. All of them are made to sign a contract joining the Ukrainian army, and now the Belarusian volunteers are formally part of Ukraine's armed forces. They still, though, fly the red and white flag, which is the pre-Soviet Belarusian flag, which nationalists in Belarus have taken as their symbol. And they operate as a self-contained unit alongside other volunteers, such as, I believe, from Georgia. And there probably are only a few hundred of them. I'm told there are 4 separate units, the main one being involved in the defense of Kiev, and possibly only a couple of hundred there. But it is of enormous symbolic importance that this neighboring country, and a country whose president, Alexander Lukashenko, is allied with the Kremlin, and although has been very cautious about getting involved in the war, is supposedly one of Vladimir Putin's allies. And there are enormous hopes pinned, that the Belarusian opposition have pinned on the fighters in Belarus, not for what will happen in Ukraine, but they are hoping that people will look from Belarus into Ukraine, see the defiance of Vladimir Putin, and that is a message which will travel all the way back to Minsk. We'll see.
We'll come back to how what's happening in Ukraine could have an impact on Belarus. But first, given that many of these volunteers were arrested in the 2020-2021 Belarusian protests against their own dictator, do they have much military experience to be fighting on the front line of this war?
Well, as I say, some of them have been there since 2014, and presumably they have military experience. And the ones who've been there for the past month are certainly getting military experience. A lot of those fighting on the Ukrainian side don't have much experience, but morale is the great determining factor in war. The Russians are certainly better equipped, probably more numerous in terms of the organized forces they can command, but they have no morale. And we've seen demoralized Russian troops retreating in a chaotic fashion, often not very well supplied, being beaten back by Ukrainian volunteers, Belarusian volunteers, foreign volunteers with ancient weapons, but the will to fight. I think that makes the difference. It's certainly making the difference now with the Ukrainians pushing the Russians back, indeed up the road to Belarus. And perhaps more important than the military contribution of these Belarusian volunteers is what has been taking place in Belarus itself. We have had reports of railway lines sabotaged, stopping the movement of troops into Belarus, stopping the movement of spare parts and fuel. There have been so-called cyber partisan attacks, shutting down the Belarusian cyber infrastructure, which the Russians again may be using. All of that, I think, might be more important because the Russians use Belarus as a staging area on their way into Ukraine. They will presumably need to use it as a safe area to patch up their wounds and regroup if they're going to counterattack. And a few hundred volunteers, I think, stand for a much larger commitment by the Belarusian public against this war. And that is why you're seeing these acts of sabotage. And it's the crucial question is, will those acts of sabotage be enough to undermine the Russian war machine?
And do you think that it's this small battalion in particular that's putting the pressure on Putin's relationship with Lukashenko?
One of a number of things, I think, far more significant would be the attitude of the Belarusian army. Now, a month ago, there were a lot of confident predictions that President Lukashenko would order the Belarusian army into action alongside Russian forces. There are only 45,000 of them, and I spoke to one Belarusian journalist who thought the actual number of combat troops they could field would be only 10,000. Not enough to make a huge difference on the battlefield, but helpful enough to Vladimir Putin's war effort. But that never happened. And I think it didn't happen because of the fears that President Lukashenko might reasonably have that the army would refuse to carry out orders. Either it would go through a show of crossing the border and carrying out some, what were described to me as fake attacks while staying as far away from the Ukrainian forces as possible, or they could outright mutiny. And certainly those are the hopes of the Belarusian opposition, if orders were given by President Lukashenko, cross the border south into Ukraine, that the army would mutiny. So the idea that these Belarusian volunteers, 200, 300, 400 of them, however many they are, would turn around and march back to Minsk to overthrow President Lukashenko, I think that is fanciful. But a far bigger risk and a far more realistic risk for him is that he is blackmailed into joining the war by President Putin, his own army mutinies, and that is the signal for a more generalized uprising against him.
If Lukashenko doesn't order his army to go and help the Russians in Ukraine, is he safe from mutiny, or is there still a chance that his own army might rebel against him, or that they might decide to go and join the small battalion and grow it in size?
I think unlikely the army, the regular army, would go and join the volunteers. They'd probably just sit on their hands. It's a black hole. We don't know what they're thinking, what they're saying. The Belarusian opposition is already calling itself the government in exile and is confidently predicting that the war in Ukraine will somehow end in what they call a free Belarus. That's the job of oppositions, to sound confident like that. I must admit that I spoke to some democracy activists and they'd had a pretty tough time. One of them had just got out of prison. She was a grandmother in her 60s. She'd been held with no charge against her for the better part of a year, arrested in front of her family. And as soon as she was released, she fled to Poland. She was a little bit more pessimistic. She thought the sequence of events would be a defeat in Ukraine for Vladimir Putin, leading to a palace coup in the Kremlin. And once Putin is gone, that is one of the main pillars of support that Alexander Lukashenko has. The other being, of course, the security forces and the police. But you would imagine they would lose confidence looking at a palace coup in the Kremlin. So opinions vary about this, but I think underlying this is the fact that probably most Belarusians oppose the war, certainly oppose getting into the war on the side of Russia, even President Lukashenko's own supporters. So he has to be very, very careful. These are very testing times for him, although I have to say that the democracy activists I spoke to nicknamed him the cockroach. He always seems to survive whatever happens to him.
I want to go back to the point you were making at the start of this about the wider objectives of this small battalion. It does seem like there is a bigger agenda here. You say in your piece for the magazine that their motto is first Ukraine, then Belarus.
Well, that's the motto. They're nationalists. They don't want to be part of a Russian empire as they would see it. So yes, of course, once the Ukrainian war is won, as they hope, they will return to Belarus. I think a few hundred volunteers are not going to make the difference on their own, but taken together with street protests, we've seen remarkably brave street protests in Belarus against the war and against President Lukashenko, possibly more than 1,000 arrests. And the opposition say there are now more than 1,000 political prisoners being held in Belarus. So if the tide of events turns in Ukraine, turns in Russia, in Moscow as well, you can see it happening to President Lukashenko too. He is treading a very difficult and narrow path between pressure from the Kremlin and making his own people so unhappy that they overthrow him.
Paul, last question to you. What are the stakes for the Belarusians fighting in Ukraine and for Ukraine? What might happen to them when they return to Belarus?
Well, I don't imagine they'll return to Belarus while President Lukashenko's in power. They'd be arrested. It's probably too early to talk about that. First, they have to win the war in Ukraine. Look, in another sense, the stakes for them are the stakes for everybody, which is ultimately and most disastrously, this could end in a nuclear exchange beyond Ukraine's borders. That's because the Kremlin is very, very deliberately playing the nuclear card, reminding the world that they have these weapons, adopting almost the mirror image of the strategic ambiguity that NATO had in the 1980s, when NATO said, well, maybe we'll use nuclear weapons, maybe we won't if we face a conventional threat. This is what Vladimir Putin is saying to the world. And I spoke to, for instance, Fraser Nelson, who used to be on the National Security Council, the official there in charge of Russia. She and other experts are saying, look, it is not impossible that Vladimir Putin uses nuclear weapons. And if he does that, it is possible that it would be a weapon, a tactical nuke, fired from Belarusian soil. The Belarusian president has forced through changes to the constitution, ending Belarus's nuclear-free status. That's another move, I'm sure, which is deeply unpopular in his country and done at the behest of the Kremlin. So ultimately, the stakes for everybody are, does this turn into a nuclear war for Belarus and for everybody else?
Paul, thanks for joining Spectator TV. And that's it for this week. Once again, don't forget to subscribe to the Spectator's YouTube channel. Just click the subscribe button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon to make sure you never miss an episode. Thanks for watching, and do join us again next week.